It's a great honor to have been asked to serve as this year's Clark Kerr Lecturer. There's no one whose legacy in higher education, or in our understanding of higher education in the 20th century, exceeds that of Clark Kerr. But he was a doer, not just an observer or a theoretician. He was the principal architect of the 1960 California Master Plan for Higher Education. This framework still governs the three systems: the University of California, the Cal State Universities, and the community college system. Determines what students are eligible for each of these systems and guarantees access for those who are qualified. His shadow looms large over the American educational landscape. His understanding, as Judd pointed out, of the emergence of the multiversity, as he famously termed it in his 1963 Godkin lecture at Harvard, crystallized our view of the tectonic changes that occurred in U.S. research universities at mid-century. But perspectives and experiences change with time and over generations. In 1963, he articulated the rapid metamorphosis of our research universities into something new and different. Campuses sprawled intellectually, even as they sprawled physically across the landscape of state after state. As they evolved, they developed a complex web of purposes, and they created increasing tensions between societal utility and what had always been considered to be academic purity. In the same year that Kerr articulated all this and much more in the Godkin Lectures, I graduated from West Virginia University and headed to Ann Arbor to begin my graduate studies in mechanical engineering at the University of Michigan. What to Kerr, as a leader of his generation, was a somewhat surprising new incarnation of the American Research University was for me a given. Michigan, MIT, Berkeley, Caltech, Stanford, universities like this were great magnetic attractors to a young engineering student who was truly a child of the Sputnik era. The source of this exciting attractiveness was to a large extent what has been termed the engineering science revolution. This revolution was spawned primarily by faculty at MIT who, building on their experiences at the radiation lab during World War II, created a radically different way of teaching and practicing engineering. The Rad Lab, which also has ties to Berkeley via E.O. Lawrence, by the way, had brought together a remarkable group of scientists and engineers to develop radar, whose key concepts and elements had been invented by the British, into a battle-hardened system that many believe was as instrumental in the Allied victory as was the work at Los Alamos. A towering legacy of this work was a new world of engineering education built on a solid foundation of science, rather than only on macroscopic phenomenology, charts, handbooks, and codes. It was research-intensive, required an entirely new panoply of textbooks and laboratories, and led and drove change in things ranging from the space program to defense, to transportation, telecommunications, and ultimately computing and medicine. MIT under Engineering Dean Gordon Brown and Stanford under Provost Frederick Terman were first movers. And Berkeley, Michigan, Illinois, and other institutions were fast followers and strong contributors. This corner of the emerging multiversity was very attractive and exciting. What a joy it was to pursue my engineering education in this heady environment, yet also to have as my personal friends medical, law, history, chemistry, mathematics, social work, education, and philosophy students. How remarkable it was to be on a campus with endless opportunity to attend world-class musical events, to visit the art museum, and to attend lectures by the most influential scholars or practitioners from every discipline imaginable. In short, I learned and worked at the new boundaries of academic engineering, and yet still felt very much a part of the great centuries-old traditions and values of academia. These two aspects of the multiversity did not then and do not today strike me as inconsistent. Rather, the multiversity as I experienced it was a noble and enabling place. What appeared to many to be sources of tension, cross-purpose, and potential conflicts of values and interest were for me a great web or mosaic to be savored and celebrated. That is what I expected a university to be, and despite the passage of 40 years, it still is. When it was announced in 1990 that I had been elected president of MIT, I received a letter from one of my Michigan colleagues, Paul McCracken, a distinguished economist and former chair of the Council of Economic Advisors. Here is the text of Paul's letter in its entirety. Dear Chuck, boy from West Virginia becomes president of MIT. The American dream. Sincerely, Paul. That brief note, in my view, encapsulates what is best about American higher education. We create opportunity. That is our mission, that's our business. This is first and foremost what society expects of us. Great public universities like Berkeley and Michigan have a special role in that mission of creating opportunity. It is captured in the epigram coined for the University of Michigan in the 19th century. An uncommon education for the common man. Now, of course, we have arguments about for whom we create opportunity and why and how, but that remains, I believe, our fundamental mission. Universities, especially research-intensive universities, also increasingly are viewed by themselves and by others as institutions that create opportunity for states, regions, nations, and industries by virtue of the economic impact of the knowledge and educated men and women they produce. This form of opportunity creation is driven largely by our research activities. The nature of and support for this kind of opportunity creation are more complicated and less uniformly agreed upon than that of providing an uncommon education for today's common person. But I, for one, believe it is another important and wonderful part of our mission. My experiences as an undergraduate at West Virginia University, as a graduate student, professor, and administrator at the University of Michigan, and as a visiting professor at Stanford, and as president of MIT, have left me with a profound respect for American higher education and a deep appreciation for the opportunities I've received, helped to develop, and observed. We in the American Academy sometimes get so wrapped up in our modest tribulations and so upset over the discrepancies between our ideals and some of the realities that we lose sight of how fundamentally good we really are at what we do. The governments that support much of our work also appear to us to understand our importance less and less, and sometimes to criticize us more than to support us. But be that as it may, the rest of the world recognizes our essential greatness and also the beauty and effectiveness of the opportunities and successes we bring to the nation and world. In country after country, they work diligently to learn our ways, to learn our means, and to emulate them within their own contexts. As is disclosed in study after study, ranking after ranking, and through that greatest of all compliments, emulation, we really are the proverbial envy of the world. This was driven home for me a few years ago when I conversed over dinner with the rector of Humboldt University in Germany. Midway through dinner, he looked at me and in all seriousness asked if I had any advice regarding how the U.S. research university model might be successfully transplanted to Germany. The irony, of course, is that in the 19th century, the U.S., and specifically the Johns Hopkins University, imported the research university model from Humboldt University. This leads me to suggest some fundamental reasons why U.S. higher education continues to be excellent, effective, and well respected by our international peers. First, a broad diversity of institutions, ranging from small liberal arts colleges to Ivy League schools and to great land-grant universities, provides a wealth of environments and opportunities for students to select a school that best matches their own need and capability. New assistant professors have freedom to choose what they teach, the topics of the research and scholarship they pursue. They are not subservient or apprenticed to senior professors, so they bring to our institutions a constant flow of new ideas, passions, and approaches. In our research universities, we meaningfully weave together teaching and research. This too brings freshness, intensity, and constant renewal. We welcome students, scholars, and faculty from other countries. They bring a defining quality of intellectual and cultural richness to our institutions. There is an implicit national science and technology policy that recognizes support of frontier research in our universities as an important responsibility of the federal government. This policy is intended to provide financial support to researchers based on their merit in a competitive marketplace of ideas. Funding for infrastructure is attached to grants and contracts and therefore flows to the researchers with the most meritorious ideas and track records. There is a tradition of individual philanthropy through which our alumni and others support our colleges and universities financially. Financial aid, especially derived from their gifts, enables talented students from families of modest means to attend even the most costly schools. Our tax laws encourage such gifts. There is open competition for faculty and students. Some institutional competition, though it may be the bane of the day-to-day lives of administrators, drives excellence. These factors are primarily structural, matters of public will, public policy, and indeed of public financial resources. Other nations could profitably consider these factors, integrating them into their own cultural and political context, and perhaps improving upon them. Intelligence, curiosity, and creativity have no national boundaries. Great universities based on this residential, research-intensive model can and do arise anywhere in the world. As demonstrated, for example, by the enormous success and impact of the Indian Institutes of Technology, which were established just in the 1960s, higher education can leap forward very rapidly. In order to keep myself refreshed, relevant, and experienced, I take advantage of one of the most cherished perquisites of an academic career, the sabbatical leave. Indeed, I go on sabbatical regularly, once every 30 years. So during my last sabbatical in 1974, my wife Becky and I packed up our young children and drove across the country from Ann Arbor to Palo Alto. It was a delightful journey covering some 4,500 miles, although it would only have been about 2,000 miles as the crow flies. One of the things I discovered is that the dominant shades of tan and gray of the soils, rocks, and wood change as one goes west. More remarkably, the color of rabbits, chipmunks, prairie dogs, and other critters change to match this shade as well. I assume they also do this in Kansas, where evolution may not apply, but we didn't get a chance to test that empirically. But on a journey from east to west, the framework for higher education also changes, not by adapting to the soil color, but as a result of the historically slow westward movement of the population and the consequent development of social and political structures. In a nutshell, private colleges and universities, often founded with religious as well as secular objectives, dominate in the East. As one moves through the Midwest and Great Plains, the Land-Grant Act, the Northwest Ordinance, and the commonly shared needs of an earlier agrarian society have left a remarkable legacy of great state universities, but only a smattering of private institutions. By the time we reach California, we encounter perhaps the most refined system of state colleges and universities, as well as a modest but exquisite second growth of private universities. Predictably, then, the relative roles of the federal and state governments with our universities also shifts and changes across the land. But it is my observation that this is less and less true as time goes on. That is, there is a significant degree of convergence of structure, purpose, and funding of public and private institutions. Having now served in a private institution for 15 years and also observed public universities by looking back at Michigan and out at many others, I can summarize their financial differences between the publics and the privates succinctly. When the economy is strong and growing and you're in a private institution, the grass is greener on the other side. When the economy is weak and declining, the grass is browner on the other side. That is to say, public and private institutions are ultimately subjected to the same economic forces, but the public seem to respond with greater volatility. One sits at MIT and usually sees a modest but steady year-to-year growth in faculty salaries. On the other hand, over the years, even the best of public institutions may have zero raises one year, double-digit increases a couple of years later. And then there's the flip side, the differing nature of capital funding. Friends in the Michigan legislature could often find the money for buildings, largely because of the attendant construction jobs, in years when salary budgets were hard to come by. At MIT, on the other hand, it was a hair-raising experience to orchestrate a major improvement of our physical campus between 1998 and 2005. We constructed approximately 25% of our current campus, while the economy and equity markets skyrocketed upward at unprecedented rates, and then decided that the laws of economics actually had not been repealed and drove back downward again. Add to that the fact that Boston area construction costs also grew at historically unprecedented rates, but did not drop back down when the economy went south, because the famous Big Dig was a huge federal project and was not subject to the laws of free market economics. You too would be ready for your once every 30-year sabbatical. Although these public-private differences have persisted for 3 or 4 decades, we are converging, I think, at a greater and greater rate. I think this is driven primarily by 3 factors. First, we are all dependent on the federal government as the lifeblood of our research and graduate education enterprises. Second, private giving and endowment support increasingly provides the edge of excellence in our state universities. Third, the roller coaster ride of the dot-com era was so extreme that even the budget of strong private universities, whose names do not begin with either H or P, had to respond with uncharacteristic swings. Thus, Caltech, MIT, and Stanford, during the last 2 years, all had to implement operating budget reductions and salary freezes of one form or another in order to position themselves back onto their traditional steady but modest growth curves. In 1969, 2/3 of every dollar expended on the MIT campus through our operating budget came from the federal government, primarily through sponsored research. By 2004, only 36% of our campus operating budget came from sponsored research, and of that, only 60% came from the federal government. So although our volume of federal research support, of course, continued to grow and certainly remains indispensable, it declined dramatically as a fraction of our operating expenses. Private support in the form of gifts, grants, and return on endowment grew from about 20% to almost 40% of our operating budget to make up that difference. Of course, tuition has also grown, but we worked very hard to restrain its rate of growth, and we must raise huge amounts of money in the form of gifts and endowment to maintain the financial aid structure that makes MIT accessible to young men and women regardless of their financial status. Because of the dominant and expensive role of science and engineering at MIT, we are perhaps at the extreme in the magnitude of these shifts, at least in the non-medical fields. But the general description of a relative federal decline and a private increase in revenues to support our mission is still generic, certainly to private research universities. Stanford, for example, would present a very similar profile. We have no state support to rely on, only tuition revenues net of financial aid, and gifts and endowment income. The story of Berkeley or UCLA or Michigan or Illinois over 40 years to some extent would be the inverse of this. On that time scale of decades, the fraction of federal research support in their operating budgets has grown dramatically, although over the last decade, outside of the biomedical fields, it has gradually leveled out and perhaps declined, even as various expenses have risen. State support has generally played the role for these public institutions that endowment has traditionally played for the privates. State support has provided infrastructure and has kept tuition and fees from growing as rapidly as they would have otherwise. Despite the role of state support, private funding increasingly supports the margin of excellence, large fractions of capital construction, and other special operating expenses of public universities. In fact, last year, of the 20 largest endowments in the United States, only 5 belong to public universities. But in 2002-2003, of the 20 largest annual fundraising totals, publics accounted for half of that top 20 universities. So in time, the endowment gap between publics and privates is going to narrow. The large alumni donor bases of public universities will make this possible. So in the availability and role of federal research support and of private fundraising, the publics and privates look more and more alike, with some diffusion of the kind of fiscal volatility that has characterized state universities starting to occur to some extent in the privates as well. But this view of convergence, while qualitatively correct, is deceptive. The reason is obvious. The reason for this deceptiveness of convergence is that the scales of public and private universities are very different. The largest endowment of a public university is that of the University of Texas System at $10.2 billion. And the largest private university endowment is Harvard's $22 billion. But the University of Texas System has 160,000 students, while Harvard has 24,000. Thus, the Texas System's endowment per student is about $64,000, while that of Harvard is almost $1 million, or 14 times that of Texas. Or to compare two institutions of more typical scale, the University of Michigan Ann Arbor's endowment per student is about $115,000, while MIT's is about $570,000, or 5 times that of Michigan. For Berkeley or UCLA, this number would be on the order of $50,000 per student. If our national economy grew steadily and strongly and the federal commitment to research and advanced education grew as well, I think that the publics and privates would continue to converge in their fiscal structure, although a healthy difference in scale and tuition levels could be maintained. But those ground rules, unfortunately, aren't the case. First, over 30 years, the last 30 years, the total federal support for university research in virtually all areas of physical and social science and of engineering have been constant in purchasing power. But during this same period, the number of public institutions capable of doing really excellent research and advanced education has clearly grown among both the publics and privates. Second, and far more important, a combination of decreased tax bases and frankly social will has led to a leveling and decline in absolute state support. The situation has varied in severity from state to state, but the basic story is more or less depressingly the same everywhere. The likely long-term consequences of these financial pressures will be a growing disparity between public and private universities in factors like faculty salary, combined with converging levels of tuition and fees. F. Alexander King has recently studied the average difference of salaries of full professors at public and private Carnegie One-class research institutions measured in constant dollars. In 1980, this difference was 2%. By 1990, this public-private salary disparity had grown to 20%, and after peaking at 27% in 1995, is about 25% today, a very large number. These overall average numbers, of course, do not present an entirely fair picture. For example, there are various differences in expectations, responsibilities, disciplinary distribution, infrastructure needs, and market forces among the professoriates of these diverse universities. And because of financial aid, the actual cost to many students and families, especially those in low-income brackets, of attending these public and private institutions is not nearly as disparate as the tuition numbers alone, if we were to examine them, might apply. But all in all, the picture these financial facts paint is one about which we should all be very concerned. The reaction of state universities to these physical realities during the next decade could well change fundamentally the landscape of American higher education. One of the words most frequently spoken by today's leaders of major public universities is privatization. Indeed, for the last 20 years or so, public university leaders have frequently observed that only 10 or 13 or 25% of their total operating budget comes from state support. Public presidents and chancellors frequently and rather accurately point out that their institutions have moved from being state-supported to state-assisted to being located in the state. This, coupled with a desire to maintain or establish absolute academic excellence, invariably leads to serious consideration of becoming private. However, I think there are both pragmatic and policy considerations that should lead one to be very cautious about this. Much of the revenue received by a university is not fungible. Federal or industrial support for research, for example, cannot be used for other purposes. Even very large fractions of private gifts and endowment are restricted for specific uses. In the budget of a typical state university, the stream of funding that supports its most fundamental mission, undergraduate education, is predominantly from its state government. When speaking of privatizing a university, by the way, one must also immediately ask, how much endowment would it take to replace my state support? On average, one expends about 5% of the market value of an endowment each year, so the necessary incremental endowment would be approximately 20 times the annual state appropriation received by the university. At the operating level for UCLA, this would be on the order of $8 billion. For Berkeley, this would be more than $10 billion. For Michigan, it would be over $7 billion. These are very substantial amounts of money, and one must be realistic before leaping to the conclusion that a university should become private. The issues of scale must also be addressed. Typical enrollments of the larger private universities are, in round numbers, 24,000 for Harvard, 19,000 for Stanford, 23,000 for Penn. Among leading state universities, enrollments are typically at least 50% larger. 32,000 for Berkeley, 37 for UCLA, 39 for Michigan, 27 for North Carolina, Chapel Hill. I suspect that to a large extent, the private enrollments are set points established by fundamental economic forces. Indeed, if one considers private colleges that do not engage substantially in sponsored research activities or have professional schools, enrollments are at least an order of magnitude smaller. One must be cautious when speaking seriously of privatizing large public universities. Caution, however, is not the same as an excuse for maintaining the status quo. The most likely outcome of all these is that the existing trends will continue, namely operating more or less privatized professional schools or other specialized units within publicly supported universities, while their core mission and much of their infrastructure remain largely state-supported. But it also is not out of the question that a small handful of leading publics might negotiate with their states for conditions under which they could truly privatize, with the state perhaps creating some of the necessary endowment in return for agreements, for example, about the number of state citizens to be educated. A good example of all this trend is the University of Virginia's law and business schools, which are now becoming private, emulating to a degree the long-standing precedents of universities such as Cornell with both public and private components. But beyond purely financial considerations of privatization of public universities, I think there is an even more important matter of policy: the nature of the social contract between the states and their universities. State universities were created to establish, above all else, opportunity for their young citizens and to advance themselves and to build the economies and general welfare of the states. They have served this purpose admirably over the years. So while contemplating changes such as privatization, universities and state governments must address the fundamental question: in the future, will we still offer an uncommon education for the common man and woman? Will our access to our campuses still be sufficient? Over time, the populations of many states have grown larger and larger. Certain public universities became excellent institutions, encompassing broad ranges of research, scholarship, and professional education that enabled them to literally provide uncommon educations for common men and women. World-class excellence of such so-called flagship universities also led to more cosmopolitan student bodies and greater catalytic roles in state economies. These institutions have become great sources of justifiable pride for their states, but it is a pride that sometimes seems transient. When I was growing up in West Virginia during the 1950s, that small state, not a very wealthy one, funded the establishment of a new hospital at its university's medical school by levying a small, targeted tax on all soft drinks sold in the state. The population thought this was great, and they felt a great pride of ownership and purpose of this university and its medical school. In a similar vein, Americans of that era were very aware of the transformative nature of the GI Bill. Hopefully my nostalgia will be forgiven, but wouldn't it be wonderful if this widespread spirit of pride and purpose in public higher education and its ownership by the populace could be regained again today? There always has been and always will be a tension between federal and state governments that provide financial support for colleges and universities and the faculties and administrators of those institutions regarding the appropriate definition and role of excellence and of access. To oversimplify the matter, governments tend to have a more utilitarian view of universities than do their faculties and administrations. Academic excellence, as we understand it, can be thought to be somewhat at odds with certain populist philosophies that frequently dominate state legislatures and/or boards of regents. Numbers of non-resident students, selection criteria for admission, tuition and fees, the allocation of financial aid, the balance of undergraduate education with graduate and professional training, and the overall size of student bodies are perennial matters of debate and tension between state governments, taxpayers, and university administrators, faculty, and students. Difficult as these matters are, they usually get resolved in due course through reasonably orderly political and administrative processes. But in our times, nothing has been so bitterly contested as the role of race and diversity more broadly in the admission of students. And these matters have not been resolved through orderly political and administrative processes. Rather, they have led to frequently acrimonious conflicts and have followed multiple pathways, including public referenda and even Supreme Court decisions. They have torn at the heart and soul of our population and of our institution. Arguments over diversity in public universities are laden with historical legacies, value systems, political ideologies, schemas for social good, legal technicalities, views of academic excellence, attempts to balance individual versus societal benefits, and assumptions about evaluating quality. These arguments are all too often spiced, I fear, with mean-spiritedness as well, but they are of central importance to the future of our states and our nation. I believe that the majority of those who engage in this debate in fact share a common view of how the world should be, namely a world with a colorblind society that has institutions capable of evaluating each university applicant on some sort of an absolute ordered scale of merit. The argument then should be a mutually respectful debate over how to reach that goal, but that's rarely the case. One camp in the debate over diversity and affirmative action assumes that we have reached, or that we should pretend to have reached, a colorblind world, and that by lining up a few metrics like SATs and grades, we can fairly and objectively order the candidates and select the students to be admitted to the freshman classes of our public institutions. The problem is, in my view, that race still matters in America, and that we are not capable of comparing each applicant on an absolute basis to all the others with some sort of simple but meaningful quantitative measure. My own view of these matters, I must tell you, is that of an engineer who believes that problems should be directly addressed and effectively solved. They are the views of one who grew up in a border state between North and South, attended segregated public schools until 9th grade, and has spent a career as a student, teacher, and administrator in public and private universities. They are based on observation and experience, passionately held, and frankly legally supported by the U.S. Supreme Court in the Bakke and University of Michigan admission cases. Simply put, I believe that we as universities must preserve the legal right and moral authority to consider race as one of many factors in college and university admissions, and in other programs and dimensions of life and learning on our campuses. Indeed, this is essential to effectively pursue a goal that is stated in MIT's mission statement, from which I quote, "MIT is dedicated to providing its students with an education that combines rigorous academic study and the excitement of discovery with the support and intellectual stimulation of a diverse campus community." To implement this, we first establish which of our 10,000 applicants crosses a very high bar of quality based on measures such as grades, test scores, and class rank, regardless of their race or of any other characteristic. But then we make the difficult, frankly subjective choices from among those applicants who crossed this high bar by assessing as best we can the whole person. Race is one of many factors that we consider at this stage to build an understanding of who each person is in the context in which he or she has demonstrated accomplishment, creativity, and drive. One of the consequences of this approach is that MIT today has 42% women, 6% African American, and 11% Hispanic American, and 2% Native American in its student body. A student body that is remarkably diverse in every other dimension you can dream of as well. I believe, frankly, this serves our nation and future well by providing opportunity to young men and women of remarkable academic talent and helping them to build the future scientific and engineering workforce and leadership that reasonably reflects our population and spectrum of cultures. This is in stark contrast to my early years as an engineering educator. When I began my career as a teaching fellow and then as an assistant professor at Michigan in the 1960s, it was extraordinary if I had more than one African American student in my classes every 2 or 3 years. It was in fact extraordinary if I had more than 1 or 2 women in a given class. And if I had either, they would almost certainly be among the best 3 or 4 students in the class, because only through nonlinearly unusual drive and commitment would these students have come to study engineering. The change from the 60s to 2005 at MIT or at Michigan is the result, I believe, of institutional leadership and occasional courage. It is the result of the determination of innumerable families and communities. And I can only conclude that despite the length of the journey, our nation is a better place than it was 3 decades ago because of it. It is for this reason that I am saddened and angered by the political actions here in the state of California that turned back the clock. This has been a state of the greatest vision and action, having created the most remarkable system of public higher education in America. But today, as a direct result of Proposition 209, as well as past regental actions, I'm informed that the Berkeley freshman class of some 3,600 students has only 108, or 3%, known to be African American kids. Among these freshmen, even worse, my understanding is that the number of black students in this year's freshman class intending to study engineering is 0. I believe this is a disservice to the future of this state and our nation, and that it in no way represents in reality the result of a rational meritocratic selection process within a colorblind society. As a pluralistic society entering a technology-dominated, highly competitive, knowledge-based age, we will need to engage the talents of all of our people. We will need a diverse, high-end workforce and leadership. In my view, at least for the moment, important instruments of state government and politics have collided head-on with the purposes and means of your great universities, with serious negative consequences for our collective future. Now, let me be clear, I deeply respect democracy, but I also believe that we have a responsibility to continue to make the case for race as one of many factors in university admission and work toward a day when the people will return the course from which they have so dramatically veered. Now let me change the subject a bit and look back to the year 1944. In November of 1944, at the end of World War II, as it approached, President Roosevelt wrote to Vannevar Bush, who was serving as head of the OSRD, the Office of Scientific Research and Development. Roosevelt noted that the successful conclusion of the war that he believed to be imminent owed much to the work of U.S. scientists and engineers. He asked Bush to establish a group to tell him how the scientific community should be organized following the war so that it could have the same positive impact on the nation's economy, health, security, and quality of life in peacetime that it had had during the war effort. Bush organized a group of committees, and in 8 months, hard to imagine in today's world, but in 8 months, delivered to President Truman his seminal and now famous report, Science, the Endless Frontier. A little-known fact is that Truman did not accept this report. He turned instead to William T. Golden, a bright and influential New York attorney, to produce a new study. In doing so, Golden, in essence, became the first presidential science advisor, and the scientific community gained a lifelong friend, supporter, and advocate. Nonetheless, the basic ideas that Bush set forth are the foundations for the most important partnership between the federal government and our universities. By implementing the concepts of Bush's report, the U.S. took a radically different approach to research and development and changed the landscape of our universities in fundamental ways. In most countries, the national infrastructure for research and development consists of public and private research laboratories that are largely disconnected from universities and education. That is the R&D infrastructure in most countries. The idea was simple to Bush, however. The federal government would pay for the conduct of research in universities, and these research grants and contracts would enable and directly support the education of graduate students. Thus, each federal dollar accomplished 2 objectives: generating new knowledge and technology, and simultaneously supporting the education of the next generation. Federal agencies, starting with the Office of Naval Research, began to implement this vision soon after the war, And in 1950, the National Science Foundation that had also been envisioned by Bush was established. Initially, most funding came from the Department of Defense and science and engineering faculties of a handful of universities like Stanford and MIT began to build major graduate programs. More and more agencies like NIH, DOE, and later on NASA established programs of university-based research, and these programs spread across both our public and private institutions and grew larger. Major growth spurts followed externalities such as the security needs of the Cold War and the response of to the Soviet launch of Sputnik and the revolution in biomedical science. This federal university partnership has transformed our universities, has been remarkably productive, and has made us the unquestioned world leaders in research-intensive education. In the pure and elegant form of this partnership, faculty or groups of faculty submit to the federal agencies proposals to support research they believe to be important. On some annual cycle, these proposals are reviewed by experts, and with their advice, the agency selects the most intellectually meritorious ones for funding. Because these programs also require buildings, lights, travel equipment, employee benefits, and so forth, the sponsoring agencies support a fair share of this indirect cost of research as well. By this ideal process, federal funds are committed through a free marketplace of ideas to support the best research done by the most talented researchers, who in turn attract the best students. Indirect costs flow together with the research, and over time, a large number of excellent research-intensive universities have blossomed. And huge numbers of bright young men and women have been educated and trained. This is the golden ideal of the federal government and universities as partners. It has been enormously effective and productive. But real things do not long inhabit ideal systems. The size and scope of the federal university partnership grew, so did its complexity, bureaucracy, and fiscal and political stresses. The source of these stresses are well known. First of all, the pool of federal dollars is never sufficient to fund all the good ideas. The number of universities capable of doing good research in advanced education, as I said earlier, has outstripped the available federal funds. Additionally, politicians are concerned that funding is not distributed appropriately across geography. Some fields are well supported while others are not. Many in Congress circumvent the process of merit review and simply earmark money in bills to flow to institutions or programs in their districts. The arguments about what is the federal government's fair share of indirect cost and about the accounting requirements spelled out in famous OMB Circular A21 are as endless as a scientific frontier envisioned by Vannevar Bush. When our economy is threatened, as it was by the Japanese manufacturing revolution in the 80s, many want to ignore fundamental research and emphasize rapidly commercializable R&D. Some believe it is bad when large revenues flow to universities and to professors based on intellectual property generated by federally sponsored research, which, by the way, is a rare event. Agencies frequently require that institutions or companies share the cost of supporting research. Regulatory burdens, reporting requirements, number and complexity of proposals that busy faculty must write seems to expand continually. Acceptance of federal funds becomes a legal hook on which for the government to impose campus policies, to eliminate affirmative action, to establish gender equity in athletics, or to insist on acceptance of military recruiters on campus. National security concerns led to arguments about what research topics should be classified and whether or not they should be conducted on university campuses. And since the horrific attacks on our nation in 2001, issues regarding visas for international students and scholars, their access to certain knowledge and technologies and the conduct of their research and education, the control of potentially dangerous biological agents, and the openness itself of scientific inquiry and communication have all become contentious issues. So wondrous as is the federal university partnership, it is also a source of ongoing tension. These matters range from mere annoyances and political inevitabilities to sources of deepest concern. But we must respect, nurture, and forever renew and improve this partnership. For too long, we in universities have tended to treat our federal funding as a birthright. It is not. Leaders in Washington have very difficult jobs, and beneath the political veneer that sometimes confounds and exasperates us, it's my experience and observation that the vast majority of them work very hard to do what they believe is right for the country. So it's our duty as faculty, students, and administrators to devote serious time and effort to better informing the public and our elected officials of what we in universities do, why we do it, and how we do it, and why it is critically important to the future of our nation and world. Let me close with a few thoughts about the third government. Having talked a bit about national and state, let me turn for just a moment to local governments. I once sat in a meeting listening to an excellent talk by the president of the University of Pennsylvania about the investments Penn was making in improving the quality of life in the long decaying area of the city adjacent to their campus. Her leadership and perspective were interesting and meritorious. But as she was talking about improving the dire conditions in the surrounding communities, the chancellor of an unnamed West Coast university leaned over and in good humor whispered in my ear, "Chuck, just what am I supposed to learn from this? My campus is surrounded by Hollywood, Westwood, and Brentwood." Now, therein lies a serious point. The community context of our campuses matters. I dare say the most complex politics that most of us face are local. When as president of MIT, I had to venture into meetings with officials of the city of Cambridge, I always carried in my suit pocket a facsimile of the letter the City of Cambridge City Council wrote to MIT in 1916 inviting us to move from Boston to Cambridge. I also frequently reflected on the fact that when I came from Ann Arbor to MIT in 1990, a small reception was held to introduce me to Cambridge officials. A former mayor of the city walked up and vigorously shook my hand and said, "You must be a good guy because you come from one of the only two other cities in the country that are nuclear-free zones." I suspect this audience can name the third one. And there was the time that our athletic director was getting a haircut and started conversing with a young man who happened to mention that he was in a soccer league, and that soccer league's games played on MIT's athletic fields. Well, this was news to the athletic director, a sort of exercise in reverse eminent domain. Many citizens are simply antagonistic toward large institutions, and their political agendas are, to use a well-worn phrase, up close and personal. As a consequence, the job of university government and community relations officers are second only in difficulty to that of our admissions and financial aid officers. Every university has the dilemma of wanting to be a good citizen of their city or town, but knowing that their perceived deep pockets are filled with money intended for students, faculty, education, research, and campus facilities, and not for other discretionary purposes. Discussions of payments in lieu of taxes, so-called pilot, are among the most difficult we engage in. The city government often views us as their patron, and our trustees shudder, on the other hand, to see money flowing to host cities when it's not absolutely required by law. So it's perhaps symbolic that my very last act, sometime after 5 p.m. on the last day I served as president of MIT, was to join with the Cambridge city manager to sign our pilot agreement. But I must say that despite these inevitable tensions and frequently orthogonal views of our roles and responsibilities, some of my greatest satisfactions have come from service-oriented programs that engage our students, our staff, and our faculty as partners with other citizens in the surrounding community. Students' experiences through such activities are sometimes literally life-changing. When I asked, as I always did, graduating seniors what they most valued about their years at MIT, I have to tell you that I think the most frequent answer was the time I spent tutoring kids in the Cambridge schools, or some similar kind of response. So to conclude, our research-intensive public and private universities increasingly have far more similarities than differences in mission, structure, and even financial support. Our federal government, despite numerous tensions, remains our indispensable partner. The role of state governments toward its public universities is evolving, it seems to me, from that of patron more to that of partner, sometimes a minor partner financially. Yet at every level, federal, state, and local, governments and universities each consider themselves to be the protagonist, having the central role, the moral authority, and the last word in setting the objective and the course. Despite its complexities and tensions, out of this stew, with philanthropists and the private sector thrown in for good measure, we have forged the greatest system of higher education in the world, and we must work hard and effectively to sustain and to continuously improve it. We must strive for innovation and excellence, but also nurture broad access to this system and to stay true to our fundamental mission of creating opportunity. Thank you very much.